Well, now we're going to join into our 8th session of Old Testament survey, which is the intertestamental period, or some refer to it as the period between the testaments. Others have referred to this as the silent era, the era when God is silent in that there is no new revelation, because Malachi is our last prophet in the Old Testament, and we'll talk more about Malachi in our 10th and final session. But that God has remained quiet, and He will remain quiet until the forerunner comes and subsequently the Messiah that Malachi talked about. And so the intertestamental period is going to go between 336 to 4 BC. So 4 BC, around the time of the birth of John the Baptist and subsequently Jesus. Now, to begin this time, it's important to deal with the Hellenist period. So the Hellenist period is in 331 to 143 BC. Now, this would be under Alexander the Great. Now, he might be a name that you are familiar with. And you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. He conquered a lot of the known world. Exactly. So from 336 BC to 323, Alexander the Great conquers much of the known world. Yet he dies at the age of 33 with no children or no apparent heirs. And we'll deal with who succeeds him in just a second. But it's important to understand that not only did he conquer the known world, he promoted the spread of Greek culture and the Greek language. This was known as Hellenism. And so his impact upon the ancient Near East and upon the Mediterranean world is going to be massive. It is one of the reasons, again, the key reason why the New Testament is going to be written in Greek, because Hellenist culture will have infiltrated the area that Jesus and the disciples will live. It will also be the reason why the Septuagint, which I mentioned earlier, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, will be composed, because he will ask that to happen. He will build libraries, such as the great library at Alexandria and other things. And so Hellenism will impact the world because of him. Because he doesn't have any children, he will be succeeded by 4 generals who will carve his kingdom up into 4 pieces. And so Palestine, which is the way that Israel was referred to at this time, will change hands 6 times between 323 and 301 BC. It will go back and forth between 2 groups, 2 of the generals that succeeded Alexander the Great. There is Ptolemy, who is in Egypt, and Seleucid, who is in Syria, and they will battle over Palestine. Because much in the same way that Poland lies between Western Europe and Russia, and so gets caught between in wars in that area of the world, in the same way Israel or Palestine will get caught in the same fire. So during this Hellenist period, there are going to be 6 wars between Syria and Egypt, between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, as they vie for control. So between 274 and 168 BC. And so Palestine will function as a buffer state between them for 200 years. And so as a result, during this time, we will see the emergence of the synagogue and the Sanhedrin, or the Council of Elders, because these will be the Jewish Jewish governing forces that will engage with the occupiers. And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees who compose the Sanhedrin, they will begin to establish themselves during this period. And I'll talk more about them later in this lecture. But it's important to understand, though, as in the case with this group and later with the Romans, as long as taxes are paid to the ruling occupier, there is peace. You pay up, we're cool. And so the Seleucids finally take over in 200 BC, and they make their claim under Antiochus III. And it's important to note that during this time as well, Rome is beginning to emerge as a major world power. Now, during this time, the Jews are still there. There is a temple, and it is functioning. Yet, there is priesthood corruption. So around 200 BC, when Antiochus III is ruling, there's a Jewish priest named Onias II. And so he's pro-Seleucid. In other words, he's pro-Antiochus. And so he gains his favor. And at the same time, other Jewish leaders supported Ptolemy. So why do I bring this up? There is a conflict. There is a division on who to support. And so when Antiochus IV, Antiochus III's son, takes over, Onias III, who is pro-Ptolemy, will lose the priesthood to his pro-Seleucid nephew, Joshua, otherwise known as Jason. But how will we do it? Jason will buy it from Antiochus. And so what this begins to do is set the precedent that the priesthood is now secularized and will now go to the highest bidder. And also, this will undermine what is happening with the priesthood, because Jason will seek to Hellenize Israel. He will bring in aspects, he will bring in the Greek religion into Israel. Now, it's during this time that, as I mentioned before, Antiochus IV is going to emerge. And he is a Seleucid leader who's also known as Epiphanes. Some of you have maybe heard of Antiochus Epiphanes. And the reason he gets the name Epiphanes is he wanted to be a god, because he thought, if I can be the meta-narrative for these people, if I can be the greater story, they will all get behind me. And so I will set myself up as a god. And his way of doing that, again, was to desecrate the temple. I'm going to go into the temple and I'm going to rip it out. I'm going to rip out in the Holy of Holies. I'm going to put a statue to Zeus, again, Hellenist, Greek god. I'm going to make the people eat pork. I'm going to sacrifice a pig in the temple. He's going to do these things to desecrate the temple to show that I am the man. And subsequently, he thought it would move and propel him to power. But yet, it backfired. And it backfired really badly, because Antiochus really didn't do his research. In fact, it backfires so badly that when he takes over the temple on the 25th of December in 167 BC, and when he desecrates it so much, he desecrates it in the hopes that the Jews would no longer think of it as the place where they were reaffirmed as a unique people. He was hoping, can I stop these people from following God? But that wasn't the case. He thought, I might be creating a new identity. But in fact, it caused the Jews to grow closer together and to buckle down. Because 3 years later to that day, there was going to be an uprising. So and it's going to happen under this guy named Judas Maccabeus. You might have heard his name. You might have even read 1st and 2nd Maccabees and read about him. Because Judas is going to appear and he's going to reconsecrate the temple. Here's the story in a nutshell. Judas's father was a priest. And when they asked Antiochus IV for someone to go and sacrifice a pig in the temple, a man went up to do so. And his father goes and kills that man, and then takes a group of men and runs into the mountains. And they hide up there, and they have a small army. And much in the same way that Gideon and his small army overtook the much larger and bigger Midianites, so Judas and his men come down and they take over Antiochus IV and his army. It's a real miracle. It's unbelievable. And they take the temple and they consecrate it, which means they've got to clean it. And so they've got to leave it for 7 days to be pure. And so they light these candles around the temple. But during those 7 days, as the temple is being purified, as it's laying rest, the candles never burn down. They stay the same height. And it becomes apparent to people that not only was the victory over Antiochus IV a miracle, this is a miracle. And it's clear that God is behind Judas. And this is what the Jews celebrate every year at Hanukkah, when they light a candle signifying each day with the menorah. And so this is a yearly reminder to the Jews of how God provided for his people, and God cleansed the oppressor that leaned over them, that sought to destroy their nation. This story will be important as we go further into New Testament backgrounds, because it's going to be used against the Romans. Because who do you think is going to take Antiochus' place in their mind? The Romans. And so the people will look for a modern-day Judas Maccabeus, a modern-day Messiah to restore the temple and the people. And so with this as well, Menelaus is going to make a larger bid to buy the priesthood from Jason. Remember, it's up for sale. And so when Antiochus was alive, before he's deposed, a fight ensues among two Jewish elite families, as Antiochus then sides with Menelaus, because Menelaus gives him more money. And so this again resonates to the people that the priesthood is up for sale and drives home the reality that it's corrupted. So once Judas and his men take over, people look to him and they say, hey, you have taken care of us. You are the man. Rule us. Be our king. And so it is the beginning of what's known as the Hasmoneans. And so Hasmonean rule is going to happen for 121 years after Antiochus, from 164 to 43 BC, as the role of king and priest are merged. Because remember, Judas Maccabeus, his father was a priest. And so this is why, incidentally, later with the Messiah, people are going to look for a king priest. So we have Judas, he's our first one, from 164 to 160, followed by his son Jonathan in 160 to 143, and then Simon in 143 to 134 BC. And he's going to be killed in 134. And so during this time, Jewish religious practices are restored as well as Jewish social practices. As I mentioned previously, First Maccabees told the story of the revolt against Antiochus Epiphanes in such a way to legitimize the Hasmoneans as the true priest kings of Israel. And this is interesting because N.T. Wright is the one that says this in his New Testament in the People of God on page 382. Because Luke is going to tell the story of Jesus in such a way as to legitimate him as the true Davidic king. By the way, N.T. Wright's book, New Testament and the People of God, is an excellent book. He's an excellent scholar when it comes to New Testament backgrounds and the intertestamental period. I know that it has really deepened my understanding, not only of the Old Testament, seeing how it comes to a close, but really deepened my understanding of the New Testament. And so I'd encourage you to check that out sometime, or at least read a little bit of it. So with continued Hasmonean rule, we had John Hyrcanus, and he rules from 134 to 104 BC. And he's an interesting one because it's during his rule that hopes arise because he conquers Samaria and Idumea, which is on the other side of the Jordan River. And so people begin to wonder, is this a new golden age? Is this a new Solomon that's going to take care of us? Are we going back to David? Because remember, they're looking for a Messiah. They're looking for someone to restore the nation. He was supported by the Sadducees, but he was opposed by the Pharisees. Since the rule of law, his rule of law, was not based upon the Torah, the Pharisees had a much greater commitment to that. He was succeeded by his son Aristobulus I in 104 to 103 BC, but he dies suddenly after overtaking Galilee. And so Alexander Janus takes over in 103 and leads to 76 BC. He's John Hyrcanus' third son. And this will be the point when the Hasmoneans reach their zenith. They reach their peak of their power because the kingdom becomes as big as it was in Solomon. And so the people think, maybe this is it. We're going back. We're being restored. Yet, he's a ruthless leader, and he doesn't care anything about religion. And so their hopes are dashed. He is subsequently followed by Alexandra Salome, who will be our only queen during the Hasmonean period. She's going to rule from 76 to 67 BC. And she's going to succeed her father as the only queen of Israel during the intertestamental period. She's going to have a son named Hyrcanus II, who's going to become high priest. And on advice from her father, she reaches peace with the Pharisees and gives them a political voice by allowing them on the Sanhedrin. So this is important because the Sanhedrin is kind of like the religious council, the council of elders. And so we see that the Pharisees have begun to grow during this intertestamental period, and now they've grown enough to have influence. And so them and the Sadducees will sit on the Sanhedrin. This is the same group, by the way, that Jesus will be tried before during his time, before he is crucified. And so her father says, you want to get these guys on your side. You want to get the Pharisees on your side so you can stay in power. After her, we have Aristobulus II, who takes over from 67 to 63 BC. He drives out his brother Hyrcanus II, who's the high priest, which leads to war and a subsequent appeal to Rome by both sides to settle the quarrel. In the end, Aristobulus is driven out and the Romans take control. And Hyrcanus is high priest from 63 to 40 BC. Now, this is important because for the Romans to take control, this is setting the table for the New Testament. This is setting the table for what will be the life of Jesus. Because the Romans now are in control of the area, and they're going to determine who's in power. And the first person they allow is Herod the Great, who shows up in 37 BC. Now, this is, again, Herod, you might be familiar with him. This is the one who meets the Magi we read in the Gospel accounts. He had a father who was Antipater II, who collected taxes for Rome, alongside Hyrcanus II. The point in bringing this up, it shows you that Herod has connections to the people who are in power. He comes from a family of power. But subsequently, Antipater is poisoned and Herod flees to Rome to gain protection. And he's anointed king of Judah by the Romans in 40 BC. But he doesn't take control until 37 BC. It's important to understand that the Jews did not make him king. It was the Romans who put him in that place. And so he was always going to be seen by the Jews as illegitimate. Yet Herod the Great desperately wanted to be king of the Jews, and he did everything he could to be legitimate in their eyes. But no matter his efforts, he was never recognized as such. Here are some of those efforts. To begin with, he marries a Hasmonean princess, so he could be part of the line. He's like, well, if I'm not royalty and I need to be Hasmonean, I'll pick up a Hasmonean princess. I'll marry one. No, not good enough. Well, what about if I rebuild the temple? So he rebuilds the temple because this is what the new king or the Messiah would do. This was the temple, by the way, that Jesus and his disciples, that they would walk through. Yet, that doesn't work either. And despite all of his efforts to gain the Pharisees' support, Herod fails to do so, though he does support their views. And so it's kind of a tragic figure in this way, in that he's desperately wanting to be received. He's desperately wanting to be loved. But the Jews just keep giving him the cold shoulder. Well, what happens after Herod the Great dies? Well, just before Herod dies, there was a group of men who ripped down an ornamental eagle that Herod had placed over the temple gate. Now, this was a big no-no. Again, remember, no visible idols. So Herod, for all of his things, for all of his wanting to be connected to the Jews, to be accepted, this is a really bad error. He should have realized, oh, no visible idols. We can't have any idols. Why would I put one up on a gate? And so he puts this thing up on the gate, and the Jews are like, no, we will not tolerate that. And a group rips it down. And so as a result of that, Herod's, one of his last acts is severe punishment of these people for doing so. And so I think it's important as well to note during this period the contrast compared to how Israel handled idols in the Old Testament. Because here, they're like, no. We rip it down and we're going to actually revolt. Whereas when you look in the Old Testament, they were just looking for idols. It even got so bad during the book of Kings that they found the golden serpent. Remember the one in Numbers they had to look up to and worship to save them from the plague of serpents? They find that and they start worshiping that. So this shows you that the nation, at least in regards to idolatry, they have learned their lesson. Nope, it is Yahweh and Yahweh alone. But immediately after Herod's death, there's a full revolt at the Passover. Again, why too at the Passover? Remember, these feasts remind the people of what Yahweh has done. And what happened at Passover? This is when Yahweh pulled his people away from the dark, evil Pharaoh, from the oppressor, and he took care of them. So man, that's some nationalistic fervor right there. So as a result, again, Herod kind of becomes a Pharaoh-like figure. And so the people, because of how the statue incident was handled, begin this revolt. And this is the second revolt that has to be dealt with. And subsequently, Herod's sons suppress this through brutal means. Now, what happens after Herod the Great? Well, Herod's sons then go to Rome to argue their right to succession. And it's naturally so, because that's how their dad got to be in control. So they go to Rome. And so while the cat's away, the mice will play. And so Revolt 3 happens while they're away. By the way, this would be happening during the early life of John the Baptist. This would be happening while Jesus would be down in Egypt as a child. So he's avoiding all of this. So revolt number 3 happens at this point. And so the Romans have to intervene. The Roman general Varus shows up. And so once he crushes that revolt, revolt number 3, he says, you know what? I need to leave an interim procurator here. And so he takes Sabinus and says, Sabinus, you're going to take this over. But Sabinus does some foolish actions, and he brings about a 4th revolt. And note when this happens, during the feast of the Pentecost. So again, another national holiday, another reminder of who these people are before God. And so that's why they stage this stuff at these times. It's because this is when passions would be at their highest. And so Sabinus is unable to stop the revolt. And he also commits a grave mistake because he allows Roman soldiers to loot the temple. Bad move, dude. Bad move. And so this leads to a 5th revolt. So now people who weren't maybe involved in this one are like, that's too far. And so now they mount up. And so we have a 5th revolt at the same time. And where some of Herod's veterans join in with a serious revolutionary movement in Galilee. So what is my point in this? Is to show you is there is tension all over Israel, all over Judea. And what's the fallout? Well, Varus returns. He settles the Galilean revolt, so he takes care of revolt number 5. He relieves Sabinus, says, all right, pal, you didn't do that. Takes care of his mess. And then he crucifies some 2,000 insurgents. Think about that. 2,000 insurgents. He puts them all along the road so that people will see, because he wants to drive home a point. And the point is this, is that the iron jaws of Rome have clamped down shut yet again. And their message is clear. You don't mess with us. And this is, again, this will be branded into the minds of these people. And they're going to know when Rome comes in, Rome doesn't mess around. Think about that, 2,000 insurgents. That's heavy. And so, what about Herod's sons? Well, we have the sons of Herod the Great who follow. Here's the problem, though. The famous boxer George Foreman had multiple sons, and he named them all George. That can be problematic. Well, Herod did the same. He named all his sons Herod. So don't be upset if you're like, I'm getting lost in the Herods here. It happens. So I'll go through and explain who part of these different Herods are. The first one is Herod Archelaus, and he rules over Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. So again, that would be on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Now you see that he only rules from 4 BC to AD 6. Well, what happened? Well, he's removed by the Romans after the Jews went to Rome to appeal for the Romans to do so. They're like, hey, we don't like this guy. Get rid of this clown. And so the Romans pull him. So Archelaus is then deposed to Galilee. And Judea now becomes a Roman province who would be ruled by a procurator instead of by someone in Syria. This is really important because who does that set the table for? Who later becomes this Roman procurator? Pilate does. And so a Roman procurator will rule over Judea. And so then they will allow Herod's other sons to rule or be basically like a governor or procurator over the other regions. This Herod is the king that Joseph refers to in Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. He doesn't reside in Galilee because later he's banished to France in AD 6. Another son of Herod was Herod Philip II. He rules from 4 BC to AD 34. He's known as Herod the Tetrarch. He ruled in Iturea, and this is the territory north and east of the Sea of Galilee. So if we've got the Sea of Galilee, he's right up here. Okay, kind of like no man's land. And we learn this in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. He marries Salome. Mark chapter 6, verses 21 to 29 gives us a little bit of influence there, insight there. Well, Salome's parents are Herod Philip I and Herodias. Herodias left Philip I for Herod Antipas. We learn this in Mark chapter 6, verse 17. This is the marriage, by the way, that John the Baptist is going to speak about when he tells Herod, the Herod mentioned in there, but it's Herod Antipas, hey, you shouldn't be, no. You need to ditch Herodias because that's your brother's wife, okay? So that's, again, you're seeing maybe some of the fog is starting to lift now. There's also Herod Agrippa I is going to take over after the death right here. And then Herod Agrippa is going to die in Acts chapter 12, verses 20 to 23. He incidentally is the Herod that kills James and imprisons Peter. And he's the king of Palestine from AD 37 to 44. He also is the father to Herod Agrippa II and Bernice, who we learn about in Acts 25, verse 13. They had an incestual relationship with each other. But again, more of that will be talked about during the New Testament survey. Another son of Herod, as I previously mentioned, was Herod Antipas. He shows up in 4 BC to 39 AD. And he's going to rule Galilee, which is where Jesus and some of his disciples would be from, or a large amount of his disciples. He's going to rule over Galilee and Perea. And Perea lies on the eastern side of the Jordan River, going down towards the first third of the Dead Sea. So you've got the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River. He's just right there on the east side. Herod Antipas is the one who kills John the Baptist because John called his marriage to Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, immoral. And this is spoken about in John 6, 17, 18. He also interrogates Jesus. We read about this in Luke 23, 6 to 12, and in Mark 6, 14 to 16. He will also later be banished to France in AD 36 by Caligula after being accused by his brother-in-law, Herod Agrippa I. So again, I guess this is where you go if you're a bad Herod. They end up sending you to France. So I don't know what that means. But those are who the Herods are. I would also encourage you to go online and look up a family tree of Herod and his family. It'll also help you see what's going on. Another important point at this juncture is to talk about who were the key players in the region at this time. And so I'll go through a couple of those. The first that come to mind are the Pharisees. The Pharisees originate around 150 BC. And it could be that the name Pharisee is translated as accurate or sharp, though we can't confirm this. It would make sense if it would be the case, though. And the Pharisees are going to be the religious power of the Sanhedrin, or the Council of Elders. The Pharisees are going to stick to the law of God. They are going to be very big about the letter of the law. Remember that movement that came out post-exile. And so they will be, again, the religious power of the Sanhedrin, whereas the Sadducees, who I'll mention here in a little bit, they will be the political power. The Pharisees are also theologically liberal in that they believed in the resurrection. Now that might be news to you. It was news to me as I researched these guys, because we also often think of them as being very religiously conservative because of how they followed the law compared to, say, the Sadducees. And they were conservative in that way. Yet the doctrine of the resurrection, that people would one day be resurrected by God, is a belief that emerged in the intertestamental period. We don't really know how it emerged. We don't know where it started. We don't know who it started from. But we know it emerges, and we know that Jesus subsequently teaches on it and believes in it as well. And so the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. And so in this way, it made them theologically liberal in that they were taking a new stance on something that was different from their Jewish predecessors. The Pharisees were also believed in the entire Bible. And this will also be important whenever we get to the Sadducees, but they held to the entire Hebrew Bible. Also, in regards to the Pharisees, they saw themselves as standing firm for the old ways, the traditions of Israel. And they were against paganism from without. So we don't want people from without, pagans from without. Nor do we want assimilation from within. We don't want our Jews, no Jews assimilating in. And so they would really stick to the law. They sought to bring moral pressure to bear upon those who had actual power. They wanted to influence the masses while also maintaining their own purity as best they could. And so we see this, by the way, when we read the gospel accounts. They are interacting with the authorities. They are one that you do not mess with. And so their goals were to honor Israel's God and as well to follow His covenant charter, to follow the law. Because again, if we don't follow the law, we're going to end up back in exile, and I don't want that to happen. And the pursuit of the full promised redemption of Israel. They are looking for the Messiah, the Mashiach, the anointed one. That's what Messiah means in Hebrew, anointed one. They're looking for who God is going to anoint and bring forth because they are looking for a resurrection of the kingdom. So let's get rid of these Romans. Let's get rid of who else. We are on the lookout. We need to stay faithful to the Word of God so that that actually happens. A few other notes about the Pharisees. In his book, Jesus and the Victory of God, on page 377, N.T. Wright states, "We don't know for sure how many Pharisees there were in the time of Jesus." He also states that it is true that different schools of Pharisees debated with one another. So it wasn't like a monolithic movement. There were different schools even within Pharisaic thought. And sometimes these debates got hot, but they also didn't find it necessary to think of assassinating each other. That's kind of a low bar. Hey, we're cool, we won't kill each other. But what that shows you is that they are willing to work with each other. As N.T. Wright points out in the Jesus and the Victory of God, page 378. In addition, he points out on page 379 that Saul of Tarsus, who will become Paul, represents the severe Shemanite line, which dominated the Pharisaic agenda at the time of Jesus. These are when he says severe, these are the hardcore guys. They are committed to the law. And this is the stuff that Jesus will fight about. Because remember, they're all about outward actions, ticking the outward boxes. And as Jesus is going to tell them, you're great at doing the outward things, but you're not letting the law change you on the inside, which is what God wants you to do. And this is where letterism will get you. You focus on the letter of the law instead of the spirit of the law. And these are the things that Jesus will take aim at time and time again as He consistently does miracles. On what day? The Sabbath. Now, another group to talk about that's very important is the Sadducees. I think I've got to underscore greatly that we don't know very much about the Sadducees. What we do know about them comes from the gospel accounts. Other than that, we don't really know much else about them. I will share with you the things that we do know. To begin with, they are politically connected to the Hasmonean Empire. Remember, these are the people who were buying the priesthood. They had money, they had wealth, and so they would be connected to the Hasmoneans, who I previously talked about. And so they are the political power of the Sanhedrin. And they also, because they buy the priesthood, or historically have, they have priestly connections due to their alliance with the Hasmoneans. And subsequently, because they can buy the priesthood, they're wealthy. And they can be materialistic. They are also conservative in their theology. And what I mean by that is this. They don't hold to the resurrection. Unlike the Pharisees, who are taking the newer liberal view that there is a resurrection, the Sadducees don't. They hold to the more conservative view in this case that there is no resurrection. They also do not believe in angels. And they only hold to the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. They don't recognize the whole thing. And so when you don't believe in a resurrection and you don't believe in angels, they also just believed that at death, that was it. And so there was this kind of old joke that's why they are sad as you see. I know, I probably shouldn't have done that, but I couldn't resist. So they are very important and they will be the other part of the Sanhedrin. And it is these two groups together, as will be discussed more in New Testament survey, that Jesus' life will rock their apple cart. He will push their power structure. And so they will combine to work with the Pharisees to bring about Jesus' demise. Because again, their preservation of power was most important. Now, the next group would be the chief priests. And they would be part of the aristocracy. And they had the highest profile. The Roman governors, in fact, held them responsible for the behavior of the general populace. And because of the Maccabean family came from priests, and they were rulers, the high priests were elevated to that level by the time of Christ. And so people looked for them for leadership. Yet, when we look in the Hebrew Scriptures, they have no tie to antiquity for that role. Now, it's a side note here as well that interestingly, being a butcher would have been a skill that all priests would have had to possess, because the temple was essentially a slaughterhouse. And so in many ways, they had to be very proficient with a knife. They are the ones who are interceding on behalf of the people, because as well, the sacrificial system is still happening. The next group, which I've already mentioned a few times so far, and you've heard, is the Sanhedrin. And this is composed of 70 plus 1. And so the high priest becomes that plus 1. And so this allows them never to have an equal vote. We can always come to a decision. Well, who composed the Sanhedrin? Well, the high priest, the chief priests, the elders, key families, and scribes. All of these people would either be Sadducees or Pharisees. And these are the folks who would comprise this group. And they pronounce judgment on civil, criminal, and religious matters. And this is what the Romans did. The Romans basically said, look, we'll put a procurator over the area and we'll let you kind of still play your little government thing. Just pay your taxes and just do what we say and we're cool. But if you start rocking the apple cart, we're going to take you out. And that's again why Jesus was dangerous to them on multiple levels, but among that, he would undercut their power structure. The Sanhedrin was also dissolved after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This will be discussed in New Testament survey, but finally the Romans to say that enough is enough, and they come from 67 AD to 70 AD, and they destroy Jerusalem. And as a result of that, the Sanhedrin is now dissolved because the Jewish diaspora, or spreading of seed, happens because they are thrown to the winds. There's also one other group that I'd like to discuss with you, and they're not mentioned in Scripture. This is kind of just more for your own information. And this is a group called the Essenes, and they would have been living during this time as well. They lived in seclusion by the wilderness near the Dead Sea, and they referred to themselves as the sons of light, or so they thought, and that all others, not just the pagans, but even other Jews, were the sons of darkness. They also saw themselves as the true representatives of Judaism over and against the group then in power, at that time the Hasmoneans. And so they tolerated the Hasmoneans, but they looked forward to a day where a new temple would be built. Because in their mind, the existing temple might have been cleansed by the Maccabean revolt. Yes, Judas Maccabeus and his guys might have cleansed it, but it was still polluted as far as this group was concerned. So they saw themselves as being called by God to be the alternative temple until that happened. Communal life was also governed by strict laws of purity, and the calendar was arranged in such a way as to enable festivals and Sabbaths to be kept properly. These people wanted to follow the law the way that God intended. And so they believed that they were the true Israel, because Israel itself was lost. These are the purists. That's the way they saw themselves. Also, in regards to Essene eschatology, or their view of the latter days, this sect looked forward to a dramatic change in the future, a time when Israel's God would act within history to redeem and reestablish them, the Essenes, as his people within his holy land and worshiping in a new temple. So to them, it would be quite wrong for a king from Judah to be presiding over the temple. That's why only a descendant from Levi, Aaron, and Zadok would do, priests in the Old Testament. And so some have speculated that this could be one of the reasons why the writer of the book of Hebrews emphasizes that Jesus came from the Melchizedekian priesthood, is emphasizing that yes, Jesus comes actually from a greater priesthood. And so what's my point in even bringing up this with the Essenes at the end? It's to emphasize that by the time the intertestamental period is coming to a close and the beginning of the New Testament era is starting by the birth of John the Baptist and subsequently Jesus Christ, that the Jews were looking for a Messiah, an anointed one, a Christos, Greek for anointed one, a Christ figure, to come and restore the nation. They were looking for a society, for changes, and society was primed for his arrival. And for more on that, I would encourage you to please sign up for the Biblical Studies New Testament Survey, where more of those things will be covered. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time as we talk about the poetical literature of the Hebrew Bible.